I spent a month in Europe and I wrote down every expense on my phone on Google Sheets. I went to Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Italy. I spent a total of 28 days in Europe and I stayed mostly in hostels and simple hotel rooms. If you're thinking of taking a trip just like this, I really recommend it because it doesn't cost as much as you would think for a whole month across the world. I'm gonna break down the expenses into accommodation, food, miscellaneous, and airfare. That way, you can look at all of them separately and see if you can do anything different to try to either get it lower or even higher if you want a fancier trip. So here we go. For accommodations, I mainly stayed in hostels, but I did stay in some small hotel rooms that weren't the fanciest, but they did get the job done. I found that sometimes a simple hotel room where you have more privacy can be a lot better value than a hostel where you have to sleep with a whole lot of other people, but it may differ depending on the time you go. If you can afford it, I really do recommend getting a private room so that you can sleep better. At least that was the case for me. All right, so let's look at the Google Sheets and see what it looks like. So for the whole 28 days I was over there, I spent a total of 1,689 euros, which averaged out to 62.57 euros a night. But if you look at this Paris situation, I didn't stay there any nights because I couldn't get there in time. I didn't stay there any nights because the trains there were blocked off and I couldn't get a train ride to Paris that day, so I ended up having to scratch that off my trip. So that did add to my total, unfortunately, but the cost is still pretty manageable. I was actually really surprised by how expensive some of the accommodations in Italy were. For instance, the one in Florence was almost $120 a night, which is kind of insane for a hostel, but when I was looking on my trip, I think I booked it a little too late in the trip, so I was kind of desperate, so I did have to go with that one, but I had a lot of fun. I was also really surprised by how cheap some of the accommodations in Switzerland were, because you always hear about how it's a super expensive country, and it really is, don't get me wrong. But when I compare it to some of the places in Italy that I went to, like Florence, it was actually cheaper to stay in Switzerland than in Italy, which is kind of crazy to me. Another thing to note is that I stayed in a couple of night trains in Italy. So from Salzburg to Venice, I took a night train and that was 41.2 euros. And my night train from Rome to Milan was about the same price at 42.84 euros. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I wouldn't do night trains again if I had to, because I didn't really sleep that well, and there's a lot of people in a very confined space, but I do think you have to do it at least once because it is an interesting experience and it does get you to your place pretty quickly. You get to spend a night traveling instead of sleeping, so it's just more efficient. But yeah, the total accommodations that I paid for 28 days was 1,689 euros. Now moving on to the food. Every time I got food, I would log it down in my phone. Of course, I logged down every expense. It's just something I was curious about on my trip. So let's look into the details. So for my entire trip, I spent 777 euros, which came out to be 27.78 euros a day. I set out a goal to keep it under 25 euros a day, but when I got over there, a lot of the food was just really good, and I decided to just live a little because I knew I was coming back to a full-time job, so it was fine anyway. An extra $2 a day for a really good experience like that, I just really recommend it. One of the things that's nice about traveling in Western Europe, and I'm sure everywhere else in Europe, is that there's a lot of nice grocery stores in every city. I didn't really take advantage of this until I got to Switzerland, because a lot of the restaurants in Switzerland were like 25, 30 francs a plate, and that was just a little too much for me at the time. I mean, I still wouldn't even pay that amount on vacation. But by using grocery stores in Switzerland, I could get by with around maybe 25 francs a day if I really tried. And there's a lot of good food at those grocery stores. There's a lot of fruit and vegetables and just pre-made sandwiches. Also, another thing is that I never cooked the entire time I was over there, because I didn't have any pots or pans and I didn't really want to have to deal with other people maybe eating my food in the hostel after I put it in the fridge. So I ended up eating a lot of fruit and just prepackaged sandwiches while I was over there. But yeah, none of these line items are very interesting to go over specifically, other than you can get some pretty decent food in Italy for really cheap at restaurants. So I really do recommend eating at restaurants in Italy because it's just a cool experience, as well as the food is just really good. And you also have to get gelato every day, which will be around 4 euros. I really think someone could get by pretty easily with 25 euros a day. Or if you're someone who doesn't eat a lot, you could get by with 20 euros a day. And I think that would be a good estimate. So now for the miscellaneous expenses. On my entire trip, I spent a total of 1,310 euros on miscellaneous items. And that includes the Eurail pass that I bought, which was 526 euros. And that accounted for pretty much half of the miscellaneous cost. Another thing I think you should get is a VPN if you get your bank account over there. I don't know, I'm not too well versed in network security, but everyone recommends getting a VPN if you're passing credentials like that over networks. Another thing that I think is totally worth it is getting a phone plan. I got this thing called Airalo, and it cost me 30 euros for 1 month with 10 gigabytes of data. And I never had to buy more data than that because I was just using it for Google Maps, sending messages through Instagram or Snapchat to my friends back home. So yeah, those are the two things that are utility bills back home that you still need to get over in Europe. And then there's just some random stuff like soap. I lost around $20 in ATM commissions because I used a credit card at a terrible ATM, so that was my bad actually. And then just a bunch of tours. If you do have to pay to see a certain site, I do recommend going and paying for it because you're halfway across the world. You might as well pay them 10 euros to go see the cool thing anyway. But another thing to note is that a lot of the third-party sites, they charge a lot more than if you went directly to the site itself. Definitely be conscious of that and check out the actual website for the attraction you're looking at. A lot of my miscellaneous expenses were actually attractions, or they were gondola rides in Switzerland or things of that nature. I will say the cable cars in Switzerland are expensive. For instance, I paid around 65 euros to get to the top of a mountain in Switzerland, and then I paid 70 euros total split among 2 other mountains later in the trip in Switzerland. And I do think that is worth it because the Alps are really nice and these lifts make it really easy to get to the top, and sometimes they're the only way to get to the top of the mountain, so definitely check those out. And if you have a Eurail pass, you're probably going to get a discount for those lifts anyway, so definitely check that out. Another thing to note is that the metro and bus tickets inside the major cities in Europe are relatively cheap. For instance, I paid $2 for each metro ride in Italy that I took, and I only did that maybe once a day. So that's a really great way to get across town in some of these cities. Okay, for flights. I will say my parents paid for my flight as a graduation gift, but I did just book another flight to Europe recently that I paid for. And depending on where you're going, if you book around 3 months out in advance, the prices are really anywhere from the high 500s to the low 1000s. My ticket to Paris cost me $600 for my next trip coming up. I did notice that a lot of the flights to Spain and London were pretty cheap. They were consistently in the low 600s to low 700s no matter when I checked. And during those times, a lot of the flights to the other cities like Frankfurt or Prague or something like that, they would often go up into the low 1000s sporadically, but the ones over on the west side of Europe, like London and Spain, they would stay consistently cheaper than the ones farther east. If you book a flight in April or May, it's gonna be cheaper than July or August because a lot of other people have their vacations planned for July and August, so there's just less demand in April and May. The same goes for September and October. So if you can plan to go on your trip during the shoulder season which is what I just talked about, it's gonna be a lot cheaper and you're probably gonna have a better time because there will be less people out and about at the major sites. So if you can go in April or even October, that's a great time to go. For the grand total, here's what I got. I wrote down that I spent a total of 3,907 euros, but I did pay roughly $143 of flight fees and taxes because I just wanted to have a little bit of skin in the game for the flight that my parents got me as a graduation gift. So if you subtract around $130 from that 4,300 United States dollars total, it comes out to be around 4,170 United States dollars for 28 days in Europe. And you have to keep in mind that I did have to pay for a Paris accommodation and some Paris attractions like Versailles and a bunch of other museums in Paris that were non-refundable, so that was my bad. I do think you can do a trip to Europe for a month for under $5,000, including the flight, if you're careful about what flight you pick and you're careful about how much you spend on eating and accommodations. But even if you do spend maybe $5,000 or $6,000 for a total month-long trip, I do think that's money well spent, assuming you can afford it. But yeah, there you go. That's all I spent in my whole month over in Europe, roughly 4,300 United States dollars, which comes out to be roughly $153 a day. I hope this video was helpful in case you were planning a trip to Europe and you wanted to see how much it might cost. Hopefully on my next trip, I can keep the accommodations a little bit cheaper and I can choose to eat at grocery stores a little bit more efficiently just to try to keep my costs down. But I'll definitely write every expense that I have and I'll put it in the Google Sheets just like my last trip, and maybe I'll make another video about it later. But yeah, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.